Hello, good evening. Welcome to another CEBRI online debate. I'm Carla Duarte. I'm the Director of Institutional Relations and Communications at CEBRI. I'm very pleased to welcome this debate entitled Three Decisive Events, the Pandemic, the Economic Crisis, and the Elections in the US, and to have here Ambassador Roberto Abdenur, who is a member of our Board of Trustees and also former ambassador to Washington and to several countries. We have here Mr. Moisés Naím, who is Distinguished Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Naím is also former Venezuela's Development Minister, and he is also former Director of its Central Bank and Executive Director at the World Bank. We have here Mr. Otaviano Canuto, who is a Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute, and he has held several leadership positions in institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and the IDB. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. I'll now hand it over to Ambassador Abdenur, who will lead our discussions here today, and then I'll come back in the end with a few questions from the audience. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. First of all, Moisés and Canuto, let me tell you both how grateful I am, how pleased I am to have you both as companions in this webinar. I have such good recollections of how we went about in my times as ambassador to Washington many years ago. Let me start by making a few comments. First of all, the economic crisis caused by the pandemic is even worse than the so-called Great Recession that followed the serious financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Some people go so far as to consider it to be close to the depression of the 1930s. So this situation raises a few questions. One, I think this is addressed above all to Canuto. One, how long will it take for a real recovery to start? Secondly, will there be a quick recovery, V-shaped, or will it be more like an extended U? Or, as Canuto points out, will it be like a square root with the final results of recovery remaining at a level below what the international economy had registered before the crisis? Fourth, will there be a significant difference between the rates of recovery between the US on one side and Europe on the other side, the US and Europe on one side and China on the other side, or thirdly, between the major developed countries and emerging countries, among them Brazil. So my fifth comment is that right now there is a flight of capital from emerging countries, including Brazil, most of Latin America. As fiscal deficits reach unprecedented levels, there is a deteriorating ratio between indebtedness and GDP. There's a fall in the price of commodities. Sometimes countries show higher levels of political and social instability and a certain lack of legal security. So the question is, will this lead to an even larger gap in wealth between developed and developing countries? Or will there be a somewhat more favorable outcome for emerging countries as low levels of interest rates in developed countries in the US, Europe, Japan make emerging economies more attractive to investments, like, for instance, in infrastructure, energy, telecoms, in the case of Brazil, for example. Another line of comments, what will be the effects of the pandemic and the economic crisis on societies, on the way capitalism functions? The pandemic brought to light the surprising, even shocking reality of very high levels of poverty and inequality, even in the wealthiest countries of the world, like the US, Britain, Italy, France, Spain, and others. This not to speak of the drastic worsening, the drastic deterioration of poverty and inequality in poorer countries like Brazil and others in our region. Millions and millions all over the world lost their jobs or other sources of income, especially those in situation of informality, a situation which covers sometimes more than 50% of the working population in Latin America. During the Great Recession of 2008, governments concentrated efforts and spent billions on shoring up the financial sector and big business. It was important to sustain banks and large companies that, as was said at that time, were too big to fail. Now the situation is very different. Governments all over the world are putting aside their concerns about fiscal austerity to throw unlimited amounts of money to protect the unemployed, the poor, and on the other hand, small and medium-sized companies which generate significant numbers of jobs. This fact has exposed the social frailty of market economies, the need for major changes in the way capitalism operates in most parts of the world. People will from now on demand a more active role for the state in areas like health, education, social security. There will be much less tolerance for poverty and inequalities. Major reforms must be made in taxation, in the distribution of financial resources by the government, in the educational system. In the case of the US, for instance, we see pressure for the adoption of an European-style kind of welfare state, which does not exist in the US right now. So the big question is, a feature of globalizing capitalism, as I would call it, a feature of globalizing capitalism over the past few decades has been increasing levels of inequality. This has also been the result of technological progress, with greater use of the internet and other sophisticated techniques, as fewer people are able to catch up with more complex means of work. At the end of the day, what will happen? We will have a softer, more socially oriented capitalism, a capitalism committed to sustainability, social responsibility by big companies, commitment to move towards a green economy, more transparency, more ethics in business? Or will we have just more of the same with only a few marginal adjustments here and there? So an important question is how to conciliate the enormous, drastic, far-reaching new 5G technology with the demands for a fairer or more just society. Let me now speak about globalization. Globalization freed hundreds of millions of people from poverty, especially in Asia and particularly in China. Unfortunately, Brazil and Latin America in general were not engaged in globalization. We didn't benefit from it. We remained at large from it. But on the other hand, globalization undoubtedly did cause the loss of jobs in Europe, in the US and in Europe. Many people in the US say that ever since the entry of China in the World Trade Organization in late 2001, no less than 2 million jobs have been lost in the US to China. A major impulse towards globalization came about when, starting at the early 80s, under the reforms and opening of China under Deng Xiaoping, China sort of entered the world economy. Interestingly, the strong connections established between China and the USA through trade, finance, investments, and technological exchanges turned out to become a major axis of globalization. But right now, the Trump government is engaged in a drastic, far-reaching strategic confrontation with China, which unfolds in 3 areas: the economy and trade, the military area, especially with tensions in the South China Sea, and thirdly, in technology. the US strategy towards China in this offensive has two aspects. First of all, it's a strategy of containment, a bit like what the US did towards the Soviet Union and communism during the days of the Cold War. But some say more radical people in the Trump government favor a total decoupling, a total separation between China and the United States. So globalization is now under attack. It slows down, it stops on its tracks, or it may be even undergoing a process of reversal. As the United States, Japan, Germany, and other countries move to force their corporations to leave China, to go back home, including programs of financial support, efforts to break value chains. With the pandemic, there's a growing realization of the dangers of excessive reliance on a single country. This happened on matters having to do with health, medication, because of most countries' dependency on China. So the concept of strategic importance will be expanded. Countries will tend to move towards greater autonomy, if not sheer autarky. So I ask myself, will there be a fortress Europe? Will there be a fortress USA? Right now, the focal point in the confrontation between the US and China is 5G technology, and thereby the situation of the big Chinese company Huawei. Surprisingly, the US finds itself right now in a situation of inferiority relative to China regarding 5G technology, regarding vaccines. The Chinese have made a political point in stating that whatever vaccine they develop will be a common good for mankind, will not be the object of commercial interest. This is important. And thirdly, a bit more remotely, China is moving forward with its very ambitious new Silk Road program to finance infrastructure projects in Asia, in Central Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, and even here in Latin America. So my last big question is, compared to what I have said, what will happen if Biden wins the elections in the United States, as seems increasingly possible? What will happen to capitalism, especially in the United States? Will it be more of the same, or will there be drastic changes for the better? What will happen to globalization? What will happen to multilateralism, which has been under attack by Trump all the way against the United Nations, against the European Union, against the WTO, against the World Health Organization, and so on and so forth? Fourthly, what about the clash between the United States and China? Quite clearly, this will be perhaps the only aspect of the US foreign policy that will have continuity with Biden. The confrontation, the strategic confrontation with China will tend to go on and perhaps even be strengthened. Another point, what will happen to the environment? Biden has already said publicly that he will bring the United States back to the Paris Agreement on climate change, unlike what Trump did when it took the US out of the arrangement. Biden quite clearly will move towards a greener economy, towards decarbonization. He has not accepted the ideas supported by the left wing of the Democratic Party of a whole Green New Deal, but he is incorporating into his programs commitments towards a greener economy. And this raises the issue of what will happen regarding Brazil. Brazil is now under pressure, under criticism, because of the wrong policies adopted by the Bolsonaro government towards the preservation of the Amazon, towards the indigenous populations, towards fire in the forests, and towards climate change. So Brazil will be on the spot quite clearly under a Biden government. Another question is, what will happen to the relations between the United States and Europe? Trump was antagonistic, was hostile to the very process of European integration. He emphatically, enthusiastically supported Brexit, and even went so far as to prod other countries in Europe to follow the example of the United Kingdom. And lastly, what will happen to the issues of human rights and democracy in the world at large? So these are questions I address to you both, Moisés and Canuto. I would very much like to hear your views on these issues. Thank you.
Mr. Naím, please.
So first of all, thank you very much, CEBRI. Thank you very much, my friend, Ambassador Roberto Abdenur, my friend, Otaviano Canuto. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to have the opportunity to exchange views with you. You have given us, Roberto, a list of very, very important questions, a long list of important questions. I will not try to address all of what you asked. They are all very pertinent. And I'm sure that Otaviano will have all the answers. And I will just concentrate on a few points. And I will organize it along the lines of the invitation and the themes of these sessions, which is the pandemic, the economic crisis, and the US election. I will just deal with headlines and in the interest of time, and then perhaps if there is the interest, we can, in the question and answer, I can develop it more. First, with the pandemic, I will not deal with the numbers. The numbers are in the newspapers every day, the challenges, the difficulties, the tragedies, the anxieties, and the surprises are there in the newspapers every day. So you don't need me to remind you how tragic the situation is and how uncertain. When will the economy go back to normal? When countries will open up? When international traffic and trade will resume at a pace like the trend line, and so on. I want to center on a few revelations, things that the pandemic has revealed. Some of them we knew, but the pandemic put it in front and center. One is something you said, Ambassador Abdenur, which is inequality. The pandemic has been terrible for the poor, has been terrible, and it created even more inequality. There is notion that this is a global problem and that is a storm in which we are all together is only half true. We are all together in the storm, but a few people have very big boats and others have nothing. So, and I have to deal with the storm without a lot of support. So that inequality, that injustice that was there and is there, has been there, is legendary. And there is a lack of proportion always between how important it is, how much we worry about it, and how little it is being done actively on that. The second point, the revelation, is how much the diminishing role of the international community. We have never ceased to be disappointed by the lack of action by international communities in international tragedies, be it Syria, be it Yemen, Venezuela, where the situation that demand an international coalition that intervenes and helps and creates more stability. We have not seen that, and the pandemic has confirmed that. The pandemic is essentially a global problem, even though it has very local conditions and consequences. It's a global thing. It's everywhere. So you would expect that countries would coordinate their actions and will work together in a multilateral way to deal with, for example, the distribution of ventilators at the beginning. And now if a vaccine shows up and we have a vaccine, you have to be prepared to a very ruthless competition for who's going to get the vaccines first, at what price, who pays, who has intellectual property, who distributes. That is not going to be in a way that is coordinated, multilateral, fair, effective. It is going to be if it looks like what we saw when there was the shortage of ventilators, in which every country, every state, every local government had to fend it for itself. Then this is what we're seeing. You know, the lack of effectiveness of multilateralism and local solutions. The third revelation is how unreliable are our health systems. Even the most expensive health system in the world, the United States. The United States spends 17% of its huge GDP in health. And yet it is shocking to see how unprepared, incompetent, inept, disorganized, and underfunded in some areas at the same time that there is massive money available. But also how it is also rife with corruption, huge corruption and waste, and you know, and a very disappointing performance. And I think that is a general rule, with few exceptions in Europe, perhaps in some other countries. But the norm around the world has been a disappointment with the health system, how weak and ineffective it is, and how improvised was the replies. The fourth point revealed by the pandemic is the war on science and the politicization of science, and how the whole debate that ought to have been scientific and led by experts has become politicized. In the United States, for example, now our main political divide is if you wear a mask or you don't. This is as crazy as deciding that you are going to divide the world in those that use safety belts when they're in a car and those that don't. It is very crazy. It is anti-scientific. It is the very vulgar, basic, dangerous politicization of science that was badly, cruelly revealed by the pandemic. Let me turn to the crisis. As with the pandemic, I'm not going to deal with the numbers. You, Ambassador Abdenur, already gave some numbers, and Otaviano will deal also with the recovery and the shape of the recovery and so on. So I will not enter into that territory. I just want to center on three things: deficits, inventory management, and corporate concentration. These may sound like unconnected issues, but are very important. The first is deficits. Remember when we had the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, 9, the mantra was frugality. Be frugal, cut your expenditures, stop in the debt, pay back your debts, and austerity, frugality, don't spend, and be fiscally conservative. That was the mantra in 2007, 2008. Today, the mantra is spend all you have and all that you don't have, and print money if you can, and don't worry about fiscal deficits. Fiscal deficit don't matter. And in fact, we have a new theory that is called the modern monetary theory that advocates this point of view. And that either people say that we don't have to worry about who's going to pay for these huge debts and deficits that the countries have, that they will sort it themselves out, either with inflation or with growth. And that, well, I believe that those deficits are going to be a very important part of the conversation in a lot of countries in the future. They will have consequences for democracy. They will pit different regions against each other. There will be generational issues about who's going to pay what when. And again, and it's not clear, the peaceful coexistence with massive deficits that we're seeing now, I don't think is sustainable, and there's going to become an issue that nobody, very few people talk about these days, and mostly to say, go ahead and spend everything you have and even what you don't have. I think that will change. So that's one point about the economic part of the crisis. The second I mentioned is inventory management. There is a rethinking, inventory management in the 90s and as a result of globalization and beyond is just in time. I don't need to have a lot of inventory to put in my factory because I will just send a message and it's going to be shipped from China. So I don't need to have very abundant storage facilities and everything else because I will have just-in-time inventory and with very deep supply lines, very deep production organizations across the world. That may change from just-in-time to just-in-case. So there's going to be a lot of inventory management that is going to be larger than in the past, just in case I will no longer have access to the supply lines that I had in the past. And this, of course, has to do with frictions with China that you alluded to, Ambassador Abdenur, and it's part of the story. But what happens with supply lines and value chains and how they're managed and how those links may be broken and therefore generate other geographies and other designs for supply lines is very, very important. The third point has to do with concentrations. We're already seeing massive concentration, corporate concentration in the big tech companies, and amazing stories about Netflix being more valuable than ExxonMobil, Tesla being more valuable than Volkswagen, and Chrysler put together. So we are seeing a lot of very strange things, but they have to do with the mega winners of this. There's going to be mega losers in this process, but there are some mega winners that are going to come out of this pandemic being giants with a huge economic power and with huge capabilities of distorting competition, even killing competition. So competition, deficits, and inventory management are three things that people don't talk about that I thought would be interesting to bring up. The third point that you have asked me to discuss is the US election. Those are, and everybody says when there's an election that there's a historic election. This is not, this is the common wisdom around the world. Everywhere there's an election, people think it's an important election. Well, this is it. This is a very important election, and it's a turning point. If Trump is reelected, we will live in a very different world than if Trump is not reelected. And this is consequential, and he's a deeply important turning point. And the election takes place in a highly divided country, highly polarized country. And let me just give you, for context, some numbers. This is a country in which people can no longer afford, a significant numbers of people, millions of people, cannot afford health, housing, education, or cannot have expectation of social mobility. That's a place where this election is going to take place. On health, as I said, 17% of GDP is spent in the United States for health, and yet 27 million people don't have health insurance. 1/3 of every American says that if it cannot go to a doctor, if it needs some medical assistance. So unaffordable healthcare is one issue, but then housing. Between 1960 and 2007, housing prices have increased 121%. Between 1960 and 2007, 121% increase in the cost of housing. At that same period, incomes have increased 29%. So owning a home is now 121% more, but your salary has grown only 29%. Unaffordable housing. Then there is unaffordable education. Education and higher education, especially in the most prestigious universities, has increased 14 times. At the same time, the consumer price index in that period, 1978 to 2007, the consumer price index increased 4 times between 78 and 2017. Yet college costs increased 14%. That means, again, that many people cannot afford higher education, or they have to go into debt. And a lot of, we see millions of Americans that have a huge debt burden for having paid very, very high tuitions and payments for education. This happens in a highly, this explains part of the ferocity of the divisions, the debates, and what will happen. If the elections were today, all the surveys indicate that Trump is going to lose and Biden is going to win. However, what we experienced with Brexit and to the first Trump election is that we were all disappointed and misguided by polls. So we now know that if elections are tomorrow, the polls say that Trump will win. But we say that with apprehension because, you know, the polls have not proven to be that reliable. There is a whole explanation of why they are now more reliable, because the numbers are bigger, the margins are bigger. Trump is losing even in states that were traditionally Republican red states that supported him quite significantly, and now he's losing there. Florida is a typical example of that. So we don't know. What we know, and you asked Ambassador Abdenur, what happens if Biden wins concerning a plethora of issues that you mentioned. I will just pick one, and that is China. The United States and China are the most important bilateral relationship in the planet. What happens in that relationship will matter to all of us. There is an inevitable chronic friction there. The United States, the established power, is facing an emerging power, China, and that always creates what is called the Thucydides trap. The general, this is a Greek general that wrote a book on the wars in Greece. And his point was that when you have a superpower or established power and you have an aspiring power, war is inevitable. Well, the world needs to make sure that war is evitable and is avoided in this case. There will be frictions, there will be conflicts, there will be misunderstandings, there will be rivalries, there will be tricks, there will be all kinds of things. But I think we all need to make sure that those frictions and difficulties between China and the United States do not escalate. It's easier said than done, but a lot is riding on that. I'm not suggesting that China is a benevolent player. China has been very aggressively behaving in the international community, stealing openly intellectual property, misbehaving in terms of trade, showing geopolitical ambitions. Let me give you a number. More new warships were sent to sea in China between 2014 and 2018 than the total of ships in the German, Spanish, Indian, and British navies. So between in the 4 years, 2014 and 2018, China manufactured and put to sea war vessels in a number that is larger to the total of ships of the largest countries in the world. So this shows a geopolitical appetite. This shows a security inclination. This shows and what they're doing in the South China Sea, the construction of artificial islands that allow them to claim territorial sovereignty over that region. All that makes it very complicated, and it's difficult to handle the situation with China, but it's indispensable that that can be handled. Finally, what would I advise Mr. Biden if he asks me what are the top foreign policy priorities for the United States and his government? And I would say that there are three: alliances, alliances, and alliances. There's nothing more important that the United States starts bringing back the network of allies around the world that share values, share perspectives, shares interests, especially, that work together in trying to provide some more effective collective interventions in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Naím. Otaviano, please. Your audio is closed.
Yes, good.
Okay.
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's really a pleasure and honor to be together with my colleagues, panelists, Ambassador Abdenur and Moisés, and you, Carla. The ambassador laid out a list, quite important stylized facts and hypotheses about several aspects of the ongoing crisis. Moisés addressed many of them and in his tight manner. And what I will try to do is to be the most, let's say, complementary as possible. Well, first of all, let me answer the provocation made by Ambassador Abdenur about the shape of the recovery. It's, of course, for obvious reasons, it's very hard to tell at this juncture because it will depend, it's depending on the dynamics of something that is non-economic, that nobody can claim to know quite well, which is the properties of the virus and its diffusion and so on. But definitely one thing we know, there is a correlation clearly between, on the one hand, the rate of infections and the bad performance of economies, regardless of the treatment that it is done. We definitely, I don't believe in any V-shaped recovery, not even in the case of the first country in, first country out, China. Among other reasons, because since the world economy will not be in good shape very soon, the full recovery of China will not be reachable given the dire straits of the client countries of China. So even in the case of China, I don't believe in a V recovery. There is the U recovery, but let's look at the following. What is this shape based on? The idea is that the economy comes before the crisis onto a trajectory of a potential GDP, then you have the shock. But then, since the crisis of coronavirus dissipates, once the virus disappears, then you return to the old line. The U is only another version of that, simply having a longer period downwards. Of course, this could be a W if you have other outbreaks of the virus. What I have proposed is the possibility of a square root. Look at this. You have the downfall, you have a recovery as soon as you open up the economy, but you don't return to the previous trajectory. I strongly believe this is the case, among other reasons, because this recovery that we watched in May, in June in the US, and are watching to some extent in Europe, is one shot. It is the pent-up demand of the confinement period that comes to the fore. But, you know, some of those you can replenish entirely, so you make up for the past, but some others not. The dinners that didn't take place in restaurants will not happen, or the trips that have been canceled and so on. So I don't believe the GDP of the countries will return easily to the old path. From there on, of course, it will all depend on the policies adopted by the countries. And by the way, the shape of the curve of recovery in each country will depend on the quality, on the effectiveness of the policies implemented to dampen the coronavirus epidemic curve, as well as the policies adopted to flatten the recession. And then in this regard, as Ambassador Abdenur remarked quite well, the drama tends to be, let's say, harder in non-developed economies for the following reasons. Take social distancing policies. Social distancing is harder to obtain if you have people living in slums. Also, the contrast between the pandemics and the supply of health facilities tends to be, let's say, harder in the case of non-advanced economies. I have daunting figures about the scarcity of ventilators in some sub-Saharan African countries. There is a country that I know, my colleagues, former colleagues of the World Bank told me, a country with millions of inhabitants in Africa that has 3 ventilators. Can you imagine this? And you also have another difficulty to cope with the crisis when it comes to flattening the recession curve by transferring income to those most vulnerable. The degree of informality in occupancy in developing countries tends to be extremely high. In the case of Brazil, it's something around 45% of the labor force, but in most sub-Saharan African countries, it reaches 90%. So it's hard to make the way for the money to reach those people. So on top of that, Ambassador Abdenur highlighted the financial shock, the outflows of capital, $90 billion from emerging markets, almost $100 billion in the 3 weeks of March, even if they have been partially reflowed back once the policies implemented by the central banks of the US and Europe, let's say, facilitated that. But still, there are other shocks affecting emerging markets and developing economies. The commodity price shock, particularly those who depend on oil, even if the downfall of the oil price had to do with other factors as well, the rivalry at a certain moment between Saudi Arabia and Russia. But there is also the shocks associated to remittance. And that's not the case of Brazil, but there are countries, developing countries, that are highly dependent. The parcel of their income coming from remittance is high. Think of Haiti, think of Tonga, think of Armenia, and also tourism. Tourism is quite important, not only for Spain and France, but also to Thailand and many other, to Kenya, and many other countries. So in the case of developing countries, it has been de facto a perfect storm. But let me say the following about the post-pandemic global economy. Things use my time to address a bit this, because I believe that, let's say, some of the remarks, most of the remarks made by Moisés and Ambassador Abdenur can be clustered into 4, let's say, broad traits that one may point out as likely legacies of the coronavirus crisis. The first is a dramatic set of significant macroeconomic impacts associated with the rise in public debt. It is true. We are watching a worldwide rise of in public debt levels, while at the same time we are watching like in previous epidemic experiences, in experience with epidemic in history, a rise in personal savings, those who can save. And all this accompanied by an increased prominence of public sectors. The question is the extent to which this prominence will, let's say, I will say something about this, quoting Dairo Acemoglu and James Robson. But that's one set of factors. Another one is the acceleration of digitization. which has come to stay, as aptly remarked by both Ambassador and Moisés more deeply, the higher levels of income inequality and the revelation of the failures of existing social welfare systems. This has come to the fore, like the cases of the US, and particularly a partial reversal of globalization. Let me use the remainder of my time to talk a bit about this. To a large extent, these traits that I mentioned, they were there before the pandemics. That's why it is apt to say that the pandemics is, at least to a large extent, accelerating history, not changing it. But it is worth highlighting, as I said, that those features that we mentioned, they also make up for what Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson called a critical juncture, which is moments in the evolution of countries. I'm referring to why nations fail, in which deep-seated instability lends itself to the possibility for sweeping institutional change, which is probably the most likely area where we might watch this. It will be certainly in the enhancement of social protection systems. I think no one will be able to, let's say, to put the rabbit again into the hat with respect to arm's length distance from the public sector, with respect to inequality, with respect to, we're going to see discussions towards the establishment of some sort of a basic income schemes. I guess I strongly believe that we are watching in the US currently the movements. They all lead to some sort of pressure, political victory of those who claim, who demand for, let's say, lower levels of inequality and more appropriate social coverage in all respects, ethnically, in gender terms, and so on. Particularly as the crisis has had a very negative distribution impact. I recommend reading two recent works produced by the World Bank and the IMF, already pointing to the data, showing how the young people, the poor people, and women are, let's say, suffering a higher blast with respect to the coronavirus impact. On digitization, of course, this was also raised new challenge. Let's think of the needs to retooling the skills of labor force. By the way, Ambassador, you mentioned the impact of China's industrialization rise on the US job. But let's remind ourselves that according to some estimates, the bulk of job losses in the US is not explainable by globalization. It is explainable particularly by technological trends and the mismatch with the labor skills of a substantial part of the US workforce. So it is a problem, even if you take out China from the picture, the problems that we see in some areas of the US, they would be there because they have been caused particularly by lack of preparedness of the labor force to the new technological conditions. Even though it is easier to put the blame on Chinese or Mexicans, the fact is that the problem lies deep in the inability of the US system to prepare, to retool its workforce. And that will not be solved, of course, by protectionism. On the globalization, it is true there will be a partial setback of productive integration across borders. The drive towards looking for safety in detriment to efficiency may lead to some reshoring of activities. There will also be, of course, the political drive by some states to internalize, to substitute imports and so on. And of course, the levels of income inequality and structural unemployment will make a ground appealing for that. But it is not written to the full extent. It all depends on what the national states demarcate as strategic. I think it comes to my mind, President Macron referring about a line of strategic sectors where, well, okay, at the minimum, it will contain medicaments and medical equipment and so on. But the longer one goes in that list, there are some costs to the countries, to the economies that implement such a policies. And let me give you something that has not very much been well diffused in Brazil, to my surprise, but it's the following. I even wrote about it. A technical paper produced by 2 economists of the Federal Reserve Bank that showed that on net terms, the US manufacturing industry was hurt by President Trump's policies. When one takes into account the retaliations and one takes into account the impact on the costs of the US manufacturing industry by imposing less efficient inputs and so on, the US manufacturing industry, instead of benefiting, was harmed by the US policies, trade policies, which shows quite clearly that even though, of course, the southern countries that left poverty, like China and many others, let's say profited, had a good play with globalization, but also the US economy also had benefits. Of course, those benefits were badly distributed within the US, and this is what lies at the core of what we have seen, the backlash against globalization in the US, also to a large extent in the UK. But guess what? The backlash anti-globalization was not as strong in these countries, in those other European countries, for instance, where there is a well-functioning social protection system. So it's a matter of how the benefits of globalization were badly shared in the advanced economies, but not that they were bad for the US economy. And this has to be highlighted because we'll all pay a price with any retrenchment of globalization. And by the way, it's not by chance that most analysts showed clearly last year that the trade frictions between the US and China had an indirect overall malign effect on the world economy performance through the uncertainty that it raised and other frictions. So to finalize, we are ongoing a moving contradiction. On the one hand, this movement toward inside, the countries moving inward to a large extent, at least in terms of, as Moisés described quite well, we saw the manifestation of such a nationalism in detriment to the rest of the world in the case of the ventilators, and we might see something similar in the case of the vaccines and so on. While at the same time, most of the major problems faced by mankind, they will demand some sort of multilateral or at least plurilateral cooperation. Think of the new other pandemics. Think of climate change. Think of cybersecurity. Think of demographic changes and migration tendencies. None of this will be able to be solved by countries individually. A good news, just to finalize my thought, is the following. There is a silver line, which is the rising perception of the problems like the issue of climate change. And I say this based on the following. I just read a report yesterday showing clearly the increase of financial funds, the attraction of funds associated to gear that supporting investment decisions with the climate change impact. And also even some funds that track themselves to environmental and social and governance good standards. So the silver lining is that, at least in this regard, and looking at the way by which investors are putting their money into the coronavirus crisis, has served as an alert to the relevance of tackling those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Otaviano. Thank you a lot. Ambassador, would you like to make any comments, or should we move to the questions from the audience?
No, just a couple of comments. I think it was really interesting for Canuto to explain that the loss of jobs in the United States or in the West at large were not exactly caused by China, but rather more of a consequence of changes in technology and the failure of educational systems to prepare people to adapt to changing technological realities. And I appreciate also the relative optimism of Canuto in saying that there's a silver lining to what's happening in that people more in companies and financial funds, etc., are becoming increasingly aware of the need for some kind of international cooperation to tackle issues like the pandemic to start with, or climate change, or cybersecurity, or political instability, and so on. So thank you very much. I remain here. Please go ahead with the questions and answers.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Ambassador. We have a question here about the US-China relations in the case of Trump winning the elections. So what are the perspectives for the US-China relations? And also, what could be the implications for Brazil and Europe? This is the first question. Who would like to go first?
Well, let me tell you, as a former ambassador to both China and to the United States, I am very, very worried, very much concerned at the prospect of a serious confrontation, of a deepening of the ongoing confrontation between the United States and China. If Trump is reelected, the tendency will be for this to become even more serious, because the radicals in Trump's team favor not just containment, as I said before, but a policy of virtual decoupling, of total separation between the United States and China. And as Moisés rightly pointed out, the most important bilateral relationship in the world today is the relationship between the United States and Brazil, and the United States and China. This affects all countries, including Brazil. I hate to think of the Thucydides trap of the risk of a conflagration of a war, a widespread military conflict between the United States and China. But I worry because tensions in the South China Sea are rising. Both the military on China's side and on the US side are becoming increasingly assertive or aggressive or saber-rattling. So I fear the possibility of at least some clashes taking place in the South China Sea area, and even a small clash between military forces from the US and China will have a very serious political and also economic impact on the whole country. So, but on the other hand, I am very much aware of the fact that Biden may turn out to be even more of a hardliner on China than Trump has been. Biden has been criticizing Trump for being too soft on China, which is somewhat surprising, because Trump really has been very, very aggressive on China. Biden, the signals that Biden emits are that he will seek to restore old alliances, for instance, with Europe through NATO, or to prop up some form of alliance among democratic countries of various parts of the world, and to do that in such a way that somehow it will be against China. I worry very much because, of course, China has become, over the past few years, by far the most important partner for Brazil in what has to do with trade both ways and investments. And Brazil, in the effort to recover from the pandemic and the current crisis, will desperately need more investments, including from China. I am very worried at the difficult position that Brazil is now in, pressed between the two major partners it has. I will not delve into that thing because I have been publicly very critical of Brazil's current foreign policy of alignment, excessive alignment with the United States. But I won't extend comments on that because it will be too much.
If I may add something to what the ambassador said, let's say, assuming that we do not morph into an open war, there will be an intensified technological rivalry. Most likely less the kind of tariff-based attacks on goods and service, and more the technological rivalry will stay. And the other grounds, the third grounds of this technological fight will matter. A dramatic place where this will matter a lot will be Europe. Among other reasons, China has been implementing what I have called in a couple of papers a couple of years ago, an overlapping globalization or a parallel globalization that is embedded, for instance, in the Belt and Road Initiative. And the whole Belt and Road Initiative, encompassing a substantial part of Africa, North Africa particularly, but also the Eastern Europe, is, let's say, an extension of the old style globalization, now this time having China at the core. But of course, the outlets for those would be Europe. And Europe will be a playing ground as well, relevant for the technological issue. We saw a signal coming from UK with the rebuttal on the Huawei, but the pressure towards alignment, as the ambassador said, will certainly increase regardless of whether you have Biden or Trump. I like to refer to the Prime Minister of Singapore. Think of Singapore, that tiny country, so much linked to China, partially comprised by, we all know the history of Singapore, how it depended on China. Guess what? Recently, the Prime Minister of Singapore declared, don't ask us to align with any one of these countries. We will remain non-aligned with any of them. Singapore. And this is a point that should be a guidepost, particularly for a country like Brazil, who has no gain, as the ambassador has said, in aligning automatically to any of these powerhouses.
Thank you, Otaviano. Mr. Naím, would you like to comment on this issue?
No, the only thing that I want to say is to qualify a lot of what is being said these days about China in the United States by Biden and by its campaign and by Trump has a lot to do with electoral positioning. And so I would not take what they have been saying in these days as a solid foundation of what they will really be doing once they are seated again, or for if they get to be the president. So one needs to take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, thank you. Another question also in the case of re-election of Trump. Is it possible to consider an alliance between US, Brazil, and UK?
Should I speak? Sorry.
Yes, sir.
Well, if I may say something, I don't think it would make any sense for an alliance between Brazil, the US, and the UK. What I presume can happen under Biden is an attempt to create some sort of vague, smooth alliance of democracies, which would then include Brazil and other Latin American countries, together with the United States, Canada, and most of Europe. There's been talk about that, I think, in the circles around Biden. So just to be short, I don't see any point in Brazil seeking an alliance with the United States and the UK particularly. We have very good relations with the UK, but they're rather remote. The UK, yes, has become, ever since the Second World War, a minor partner to the United States. It has lost its empire, and it acted over the past few decades as a sort of bridge between the US and Europe through NATO, through the so-called Atlantic Alliance. And now with Brexit taking place, the United Kingdom is desperately in need of new markets and new sources of investment. And therefore, it's in a weaker position, and it's therefore seeking to please the United States as much as possible. They went so far not just to ban Huawei from competing in new projects, but in making it compulsory for existing telecom operators in the UK to get rid of Huawei or other Chinese components in their existing networks of communication. So this is a very serious step. And again, just to finalize, I think that like Singapore, which Canuto mentioned now, it is important for Brazil to resist the pressures the US is making and will most likely continue to make on Brazil, and keep a proper distance between the United States and China, not to seek alignment with one side to the detriment of our relations with the other side. And unfortunately, I fear the tendency of the current Brazilian government under Bolsonaro is to insist on alignment in a position of subservience towards Trump and his government.
Yeah, Brazil needs to be a fair ground for whoever wants to invest.
Thank you.
Sorry?
I just said that we have to be a ground friendly to those who want to invest in Brazil, regardless of the home, the origin of the capital. Yeah.
I have a question here. Sorry, about the. Can I move on? Sorry. Yes. Okay. I have a question here about what role could technology play in helping the international actors deal with the inequalities reinforced by the pandemic and consequent economic crisis? And what role could it play in smoothing the obstacles posed for multilateralism in this context? Mr.
I think
Naím,
that's a good question for Moisés and Canuto.
Yes, exactly.
So one of the Latin America is going to be, and Brazil is going to be deeply affected in coming years by climate change and digitalization. It may be that this pandemic is just a general rehearsal for a major, massive global climate accident that will require responses that are very difficult. There is no reason not to believe that climate change is accelerating, and extreme climate events that is creating are becoming more costly, more frequent, and more devastating. So that's one of the external shocks that is going to rock Latin America and Brazil. The other is digitalization, is the whole thing about artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computer, and all of what you read in newspapers and listen about. This is going to change the world in very profound ways, including ways that we cannot imagine at this point. The question is if these new technologies are going to help Latin America leapfrog and jump ahead and leverage those technologies to create new opportunities for growth, for employment, and for development. Or will these technologies will accentuate the existing unemployment, informality, lack of growth, stagnation, lack of dynamism in the economy and in technology and science? So different countries will have different capacities to respond to this. The nature of universities, their capability of universities to attract and retain talent, both domestic and international, the amount of funds that are available for research and development, the connection between universities and the private sector and the innovation. All of that, what does it take to become a technological hub that creates new products that are intensively users of artificial intelligence? So again, we have to expect a major disruption caused by digitalization, and we don't know yet how if it's going to be a blessing or a curse.
Yeah. May I try to complement what Moisés said? It is true the following. Latin America, our region, or most countries in our region, have been trapped, crushed in between, let's say, the frontier and the new incoming from behind, the developing countries from Asia, those successful have come on. The region has lagged behind because of low investment ratios, because of lack of appropriate infrastructure conditions, lack of appropriate business environment conditions, and other aspects. Guess what? What is necessary for the next stage is exactly the same of that. So either the region, the countries in the region face those obstacles to progress, or they will be in deeper trouble. I know a factory, a shoe factory in Atlanta, that is capable of using 3D printing to produce shoes according to the shape of one's foot. Can you imagine that? So no one can beat in comfort for you. The guys produce, and this is all done through the intensive use of technology. Shoes, which is something that in the past, low cost labor was a competitive factor for many countries. They're not there able to beat the Vietnamese, but they are in that direction. At the same time, provided that there is local infrastructure, appropriate and human capital and availability of skilled labor, São Paulo might have, let's say, dozens of those shoe factories. One interesting aspect highlighted by Moisés, which is this trend toward concentration, with the big winners being the platforms. We may come to a point where an Amazon of life might, let's say, offer any one of us to be a manufacturer. giving us equipments, as long as we provide goods to their platforms. Of course, that would lead to such a concentration in profit margins that it would be a problem in itself. But the point is that the technological change, they have a dark side, which is this recovery of advantage for areas already, let's say, well equipped in terms of infrastructure and availability of human capital. But also they open opportunity as long as the homework is done. Point is, our region, Latin America, has broad terms, with some minor exceptions, but which are not as successful as the Chinese, for instance. We have lagged behind in doing our homework in terms of institutional updating, in terms of investing more in infrastructure and so on. If we do that homework, we can benefit from spillovers of technology. If not, we will keep on lagging behind.
I'd like to add a comment to that. The Brazilian government has already decided to postpone to next year the bid for competition for frequencies of 5G. I think this is bad. Brazil should hurry, lose no time in moving forward in technology, in new technology. As you said, just to pick up your example, Canuto, Brazil is a major producer and exporter of shoes. Now, when you see technology being sophisticated technology being applied to shoe production, if Brazil doesn't do the same, we will probably be kept away from the markets. We will lose markets. Secondly, the other very bad thing that is happening in Brazil for the past year and a half is that there has been very little attention to education in general. The right-wing government of Bolsonaro sees education, sees the academia, the universities as battlefields for a cultural war against the supposedly existing communist tendencies. This is very bad. Brazil has lost a lot of time in terms of education, from primary education to university, and Bolsonaro himself is skeptic or even hostile to sciences. He's showing this in his behavior towards the pandemic. He's not taking it seriously. The federal government has failed to act. People are dying, tens of thousands. We're coming close to 100,000 deaths in a few more days. And the Bolsonaro government has not been acting in a consistent way to either fight the pandemic or improve education in Brazil. So I fear very much that, again, Brazil will enter a whole new decade of backwardness if we don't move forward quickly with 5G technology.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I'd like to thank all of you. Thank you, Otaviano. Thank you very much, Mr. Naím, for joining us today. So do you have any final comments that you'd like to add?
I just want to thank very much Moisés and Canuto for accepting my invitation to take part in this webinar. Thank you so much to both of you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you soon again. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
And I'm a fan of CEBRI's work, and so it's been a pleasure and honor to be here with you guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.